Thanks. Hi, everyone. So good to see so many of you. I hope I get to talk to a good few of you in person as well. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, nice to see you all.
So Michelle and I are here to talk about a project that we are currently working on together for Falck, the company that we both work for. I'm going to do just a short introduction for some context, and then I have a lot of questions for Michelle as someone who is not a trained designer but has been working with us as a designer on this project. So at Falck, our purpose is to advance sustainable healthcare to meet people's changing needs. What does this mean? We have a lot of different types of activities that we do. We have services for the public sector, like running ambulances for cities and regions. We also have private sector services, like employee health for businesses, and also doctor-on-demand services for families. We are a Danish company founded almost 120 years ago, active in a lot of different countries with kind of particular hubs in Scandinavia, in California, and in Colombia in South America. Falck is majority owned by the Lundbeck Foundation, which funnels its profits into neuroscience research. And we have about 25,000 employees who are everything from doctors, nurses, psychologists like Michelle, who sits in our Danish psychology team, physiotherapists, paramedics, of course, and then some support staff like me. I work in a small innovation team doing service design projects to help develop the different parts of the business. So when I think about where this project started, I think about an interview with this woman. Obviously, it's not her real name or her real photograph, but this is her in spirit. Someone who I interviewed with a colleague in California in about 2019. So Fiona here, she lives in a big city, and I was there interviewing her about the experience of being a patient in an ambulance, because she'd had a bicycle accident, and so an ambulance was called, and so we were going through that experience. And as part of this interview, I also asked her if she'd had any other experiences with ambulances that she wanted to talk about. And she told me about this time when someone got shot on her street. And it was kind of in the middle of the afternoon, and she was at home, and she kind of saw it happen through the window. And then she was out there on the street, kind of at the scene for a really long time, and there were so many people, and there were children, and so many emotions, and people were in shock, and they were afraid, and they were sad. And obviously this really impacted her. Being a bystander at this scene really impacted her more than being a patient in this bicycle accident. And this story really stuck with us, and we were doing this other project at the time, but then we got the opportunity to do a project on this, like what is the experience of being a bystander at an emergency scene? And I have a little video about what we called Project Lighthouse that sets the scene a little bit about where we are.
I Falck, der ved vi, hvor stor en forskel pårørende og vidner til ulykkestilfælde de gør. Det er dem, der ringer efter hjælp, det er dem, der passer på patienten, før ambulancen ankommer, og det er dem, der udfører praktiske gøremål, mens ambulancen er på stedet. Projekt Lighthouse, det handler om at sørge for, at vidner og pårørende får den rigtige støtte, og det har været vidne til et ulykkestilfælde. Hos Falck i Region Sjælland, der tester vi en ny service for de her pårørende og vidner til ulykkestilfælde. Først og fremmest så laver vores ambulancefolk defusing på skadestedet. Efterfølgende udleverer de et kort med råd og vejledning, og til slut så vil man også kunne blive ringet op af en af Falcks psykologer.
Vores reddere gør i dag et stort stykke arbejde ude på skadestederne, men mange har stået i situationer, hvor de har et behov for at gerne vil gøre noget mere for de efterladte, altså pårørende, vidnerne, der er havnet i den her situation. Det her projekt vil give redderne nogle rigtig gode redskaber til at kunne håndtere og tilbyde noget ekstra råd og vejledning til de borgere, som er havnet i en situation, hvor de har været vidne til eller er pårørende til en situation. Projektet her giver redderne nogle redskaber, så der er noget sikkerhed for, at der er nogen, der tager sig af borgerne, eller borgerne ved, hvad de skal gøre i den her situation, de er havnet i.
So right now we are live with a pilot in one region in Denmark, trying to measure, as Siobhan said, which is of course very important, what the actual impact could be of this and what kind of volume data we might be seeing. So the components that we're testing right now are these navigation cards that you saw in the video that give bystanders some advice and some instructions of what could be good now to do now in the moment to kind of calm down the nervous system. And they also give instructions for how to sign up to a follow-up call with one of our psychologists, i.e. Michelle. And then we're also testing some on-scene support, so some kind of in-the-moment diffusing with an advanced paramedic at the most severe emergencies. And all of this would not have been possible without a lot of different people who work together to collaborate on this. So the parts of the ambulance team that you saw in the video, Mats and Martin and many more people, as well as our psychology team with kind of Michelle leading the work there. And so we wanted to talk a bit about our collaboration on this, and we've very loosely structured that around 3 points. So first of all, for me, the best part about working on this project has been working together with people who are really open to change and who are really enthusiastic about making improvements and also open about when it comes to trying out new methods, which is something that really defines Michelle, I think. And Michelle, the first time that we ever spoke, you told me about how much you wanted to combine development work with your clinical work. So where did that drive come from for you?
Yeah, I think that for me it originates from the beginning of my time studying psychology, to be honest. I saw this vast field quickly developing in a lot of different directions, and I was really intrigued by that movement. But I was also quite often wondering, how can we make this more accessible for other kinds of professions or projects? Sometimes the world of psychology can be very much within its own little world. And then there's a component to these kinds of development projects that are creativity that I sometimes miss within the clinical work of psychology, and that I found that I could more easily find within development projects, and that I've definitely experienced in this project Lighthouse.
So when it comes to development projects within psychology, how do those usually work? What is the process usually like?
I guess that the processes are tending to be a bit more academic as we know it. Psychology usually relies quite heavily on the scientific method. And I think that quite often there's more focus on advancing the knowledge more than creating methods around the practicalities. So it's more towards academic research projects, or you might be positioned at a certain institution where they, alongside their clinical work, do projects and stuff like that. But I think a bit more towards the scientific method.
So what's it been like being part of a service design process? How is it different?
It's been good. It's been loads of fun, to be honest. It's very new to me, the whole world of service design. So I was just very much intrigued towards, what different kinds of tools do you use, and how can we collaborate? As I said, how can I help make the knowledge of psychology way more accessible within this project for you? And to be honest, it's been a lot of fun, and I've definitely gotten the sense that I was able to be very creative, and that your tools were quite creative. So I've been very inspired as well, and it's been quite comfortable, to be honest. In my psychologist unit, we've quite often during this process joked about how nice it is to suddenly have aesthetically pleasing PowerPoints, which is not something that we usually have, not at least in the more traditional sense of psychology. So I've truly enjoyed it.
I mean, we've talked about this before, about feeling kind of comfortable with each other. And for me, I mean, obviously we would never have tried to do this project without expert input from psychologists, but just the feeling of safety that it gives me to learn some of the nuances of psychology and be able to implement that in a project like this, like, it would feel quite scary, I think, not to have that. And it can be just small things, like when I first started thinking about the follow-up call, to me it seemed kind of natural that would be talking through exactly what had happened. So going through, oh, I did this, and then I saw this, and then this happened. But then I learned from you that actually reliving an experience in that way has to be done in a very controlled setting, or it can actually make people feel even worse, and it can have negative outcomes. So, you know, being able to bounce these things off you and understand what actually works from a treatment perspective in psychology has been really fantastic. So what do you think, after having gone through this process, service designers should think about when bringing in other professionals, like health professionals, into their work?
I think that, first of all, recognizing the resources available. So our day-to-day work life can differ quite a lot. And I know that you guys are quite used to having perhaps a longer period of time to develop a project, or just even having the word developing within your work day is quite something strange to some of us, at least. And I think within that, for me, it's been really important that you've been transparent in your demands, letting me know why is it important that I set 2 hours aside for a brainstorm when I usually have clients, or I usually have these other things that I have to do. So I think that that's very important, because of course it's been really valuable to have these brainstorms, but just being transparent, inviting me in, and all of the considerations. And lastly, I think make room for play and give space to the different points of motivation. For me, I was really motivated in being included in creative processes that I didn't know much about. For me to get a sense of ownership, that was important for me, but of course it can differ from person to person.
Yeah, of course. So our next point is starting with a need that you can all get behind. And we were quite lucky in this project that we sort of identified this problem space that was quite easy for everyone to recognize in their work. Like the paramedics, as soon as we started bringing it up to them, like, oh, the bystanders, like how do you feel, you know, about that interaction? How are people at the scene? How are they reacting? What does that look like to you? Then we started hearing these stories of like, oh yeah, it actually feels quite bad to just leave them there. I mean, obviously they're focused on the patient, but these people who are in shock or who are in grief, to not be able to help them as well, that was something that the paramedics had thought about in their work, and that actually impacted them in their work. So they could really see and recognize the need, and the psychology team as well were really on board as soon as we started talking about it. And this is, I think, sometimes a luxury in service design projects. Sometimes we get to focus on this super clear need and problem, and sometimes it's, you know, more like a business opportunity that we have to focus on. And I think for this, just it's been really important and really nice. So we dug into it a little bit more. We did a representative survey in Denmark of people who had been bystanders to a life-threatening emergency, and we got some really interesting numbers from that. Like actually, almost a quarter of them had developed some kind of psychological symptoms afterwards, and this could be things like having trouble sleeping or feeling really irritable. And then just over 7% even had so many of these symptoms that they would be symptomatic for PTSD after having gone through this experience. We spoke to one young woman who did CPR on her neighbor, and she described the months afterwards as being really, really difficult. And we spoke to her a couple of years after, and she was still struggling with this experience and felt like she should have done more to try to save this man, even though she was the only one in her family and also in the neighbor's family who actually knew what to do, who actually acted in the situation. She felt guilt after that because he passed away, when actually that is the most common outcome, even when someone does CPR, so it wasn't, of course, her fault at all. So, Michelle, can you explain from a psychological perspective what happens when you're in a situation like this? What happens to the bystanders?
Yes, of course. So the perspective we've been working with is that when something happens quite suddenly, we have this intelligence system in our body, mind-body connection, that we can call an acute stress reaction. And it's a system that's created to protect us. So, okay, something unplanned is happening, we need to be more aware. And what's been important in this project has been to recognize that the symptoms and the behavior from this acute stress reaction can vary greatly from person to person, but they're all very valid. So during the experience, some people might react. They might run over to the patient. They might call 911. Other people might freeze up. In the aftermath, some people might get very tired. Some people have a need to work even more, or some people are caught up in feelings of anger or grief, or undisturbing reactions, or just having trouble finding meaning in this experience. So what we wanted to do is to normalize that there is a reaction, your body reacts, and that it differs quite a lot. And in the psychologist team, we recognize that unresolved things can affect our lives later on, especially things where one lacks a sense of control or have difficulties finding meaning in the accident or one's reaction.
Yeah, I think that's another example of where it's been really important for us in the design team to understand, the nuances of psychology. Like, we were playing around with the idea of gratitude in this solution. So could a part of the solution be saying thank you to the bystanders who actually step in before we arrive, and saying, you know, we really appreciate that you did this, that you stepped in, and that maybe that would help them feel better. But then, you know, that is just one example of a reaction that also people can't control. You can't control if you're going to be the one who steps in and does CPR, if you're going to be the person who freezes. And obviously we don't want to make people with different reactions feel worse about the situation. So we kind of put that aside, that, okay, we're not going to focus on gratitude. We're going to focus on normalizing a wider range of reactions that people might have. So with a mental health need like this and other ones, what do you think is important for designers when stepping into this space, stepping into mental health?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because as you might all know in the audience, mental health is, we talk quite a lot more about it than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I think that as quite a lot of other different fields of study, psychology might be at risk of becoming a trend, and trends can quite quickly develop. So I think one thing that's important to think about is to look beyond the trend, to not make the project simplistic. So why is this trend relevant right now in society? What is underneath it? What is the underlying problem? And ask yourself, do you want to go into that trend, or do you want to nuance it, or do you want to make something new of it? So again, back to what you said, Anna, we need the nuances when we're talking about mental health. And I think that for some professionals, it sometimes it might be a barrier to collaborate with service designers or consultants, because there might be some thoughts about, hey, is it going to be too simplistic? Is it going to be a trend that we're just following along?
Yeah. I'm going to move on to our last point, which is to be humble and stick close to reality has been something important for us as a team. We had a lot of data going into this. We had all of our operations data, we had our survey, and that was really useful in putting together a first prototype. But then we've learned the most from actually being out there in the field and doing this pilot that we're in the middle of now, so we don't really know what the results will be yet. But even before then, going out and doing ride-alongs in the ambulances has taught us so much. And Michelle, I know you were out there meeting the paramedics and doing ride-along. Tell us a bit about that. How was that for you?
Yeah, I was doing a ride along with the paramedics while we were creating the protocols and thinking about how should these treatment cards be and how should they be handed out. And it was very valuable for me to do a ride along. I think most of all for me as a professional psychologist, in the way that I work normally, I see clients and patients when they've got up in the morning, perhaps they've taken a shower and they've transported themselves to my clinic. But here I got to see people in, maybe they were eating breakfast when the accident happened, or they didn't have time to prepare themselves. So that were quite valuable to actually see the acute reaction when it was happening. And you mentioned it in the beginning of our talk, but it was very valuable for me to talk to the paramedics, because I also quite quickly noticed their motivation for the project. It's been a really interesting spillover effect that the paramedics, as you might know already, their psychological work environment is quite tough. So for them to be able to say, "Hey, I've seen you, dear bystander. It's okay that you have a reaction," and then drive off with the patient, for them it can kind of release some of the emotional heaviness of their job.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for me going out as well, it's been great to speak to them and see kind of what the reality is of an ambulance in an emergency situation, because it's kind of different from what you see in the movies or in the series. There's a lot less running. It's more kind of calm and collected, which of course it has to be for the paramedics to be able to make good decisions and do things thoroughly and properly. And this is something that we're coming in and kind of putting on top of their work that they already do. They have their primary job, which is, of course, stabilizing the patient and then taking them to hospital. And so it needed to be something that was really simple for them to use, not a burden on top of that. So we had all of these kind of high-flying ideas in the beginning of like, oh, maybe it's an app that every citizen in Denmark has, or maybe it's, something that the phone could react when an ambulance is near and they would get something, and it just ended up that operationally it worked out better with these paper cards. Also, just from a psychological perspective, you told us about the impact of just being handed something physical as well is an intervention in itself, being given something. And so that was really interesting for me to see, and also just to relinquish some of this control that you want to have as a designer. You want to have control of all of the different details of what you're developing, but in the end, at the end of the day, the paramedics and the psychologists are the experts on their job, and they're the people who are going to use their judgment to provide your service to the users. So we struggled with some things, like For example, we wanted to do a control group in the pilot as well, who wouldn't get the same kind of advice or the follow-up calls, to see if we could see a difference in the psychological reactions that they had afterwards. But the paramedics are just not that interested in handing out a control card to someone who is, in a shock reaction. They want to give everyone a treatment card. And of course, I felt the same way when I was out there doing the ride-alongs. I didn't want to give a control card to someone who I could see was being impacted. So sometimes you also just have to roll with that. People on the ground, the professionals will do what they think is best, which is also exactly what they should be doing. So a last question for you, Michelle. Testing things kind of live in the health space, it can feel slightly scary or slightly daunting. Also thinking back to our keynote speech this morning from Pardis and Julia about doing no harm. We've talked about all of the nuance in psychology. So what would you say to designers who maybe want to move into mental health but feel like, oh, there might be potential here to, make some mistakes, so I'm not going to go there? What advice would you give?
First off, I'm just going to say there's some constructive work in the building, so if you can hear anything in the background, that's just it. Sorry about that. But no, it's a great question and a valid concern, I'd say, and we have it a lot within my profession. It's always a dilemma: should we tell people how badly it can get, and they know the risks, or is it going to be a normalization of their reactions that they can actually use in a positive way? So I think first off, my advice is to break it down. Yes, there are a lot of nuances to just go one at a time. How much can we control in this? And if there's no control at all, are we okay with it just moving, or should we leave that aside just for this project? And I think something that can ease those concerns is to create a safety net when you work with people that might be at risk of mental health problems. Before you get into the project, create research existing mental health services where people can get further help if needed, and hand it to them, or just make sure that you have something to pass on when you're finished in your contact with them. And another thing is to take care of yourself. I think that like many other issues of mental health can get quite personal. And you've done a ride-along that's very strange for you, just to see people in that traumatic happening, right? So team up as colleagues and use each other. That makes perfect sense in these processes. And lastly, I'd like to say, definitely go for it. I get that there can be quite a lot of concerns, and it can be quite strange to work with something that's a bit more that we don't even know enough about it as a society. But that's why we really need you. We need you to back up on creating a lot of better knowledge on all of the practicalities and how we can collaborate in the future.
Cool. Thanks, Michelle. With that, thank you very much for listening.